Powerful PCs keep getting smaller, and it appears that we have a mega fight on our hands. Geekcom sponsored this video for me to check out and put these two mini PC systems toe to toe to see which one comes out on top. We have the Intel NUC 13 versus the AS6 powered by Asus running AMD hardware. And what I found was actually incredibly surprising, because in our previous video where we checked out the NUC 13, it put up some decent numbers, especially with its 13th gen i7 1360p, 12 cores, 6 threads running at 4.6 gigahertz. It has the Iris Xe graphics alongside 32 gigs of DDR4 3200 megahertz RAM, a 1 terabyte SSD, Wi-Fi 6E, AX211 with Bluetooth 5.3, and all the customizability that you could possibly want in a PC of this form factor, with swappable RAM, SSDs, and the ability to fit a 2.5-inch SSD. The AS6 holds basically all of those same specs, but on the Team Red side of things. So yes, it does have swappable RAM, swappable storage, capable of fitting a 2.5-inch hard drive, can be base mounted just like the NUC 13 can, but instead of having a 12-core 16-thread CPU, it only has an 8-core 16-thread CPU in the Ryzen 9 6900HX, which features the Radeon 680M as the GPU versus the Iris Xe graphics. But the big upgrade that you find in here is that it actually has DDR5 RAM coming in at 4800 megatransfers per second, which is 1.5 times faster than the 3200 megatransfers that's on the NUC, as well as being more efficient. Additionally, it has a 1 terabyte Gen 4 SSD with Wi-Fi 6E, but only Bluetooth 5.2, a small step down. And even in terms of I/O, I was mightily impressed with what the NUC 13 had to offer, especially with all of its connectivity to displays, as well as USBs, 2 10 gig front USB-As, a headset port and a power button, the Kensington lock, rear dual HDMI 2.1 ports, dual Thunderbolt 4 ports on the back, a 2.5 gig Ethernet, and 2 USB ports on the back. The AS6 comes incredibly close to matching, if not what some would say beating it, especially with its layout of the port. On the front, it has 2 USB-A ports and a USB-C Thunderbolt 4 port alongside the headset and the power button that the NUC also has. Same Kensington lock on the left side, and then on the rear you find a similar situation of dual HDMI 2.1 ports, but with an additional DisplayPort 1.4 port, and then another USB 4 Type-C capable of 40 gigabits per second and Thunderbolt 4. You find 3 additional USB-A 3.2 Gen 1 ports, a 2.5 gig LAN, and a power in. So you get that front additional USB-C, as well as the additional DisplayPort 1.4 port on the back with the Thunderbolt 4 ports capable of carrying a DisplayPort signal. And this has a lot of potential for you to be able to get a ton of displays set up on a small form factor, and because it also has VESA compatibility, you could have this mounted to the back of your monitor. Now, none of that matters if the price isn't good and the performance isn't there, and then more importantly, the value isn't there. I covered how I was impressed by the NUC 13 in that previous video. It played games at a modestly okay resolution and frame rate for being just a mini PC with no dedicated graphics card. It performed pretty good at rendering 4K videos in our Premiere Pro test, allowing me to get the work done that I needed to. And it did all of that while drawing only 65 watts, which is very important because I was planning on sending this back home with Reece, my South African thumbnail designer who's visiting here in the States. I wanted him to have something that is more power efficient than his desktop setup at home, so that way he can have a solution for when load shedding hits, which is a power outage situation they have in South Africa of rolling blackouts, and having something that sips power is good for keeping your battery backup lasting longer. And I thought this was what I was going to send him home with. Turns out the AS6, in every single application that I tested the NUC 13 in, the AS6 wiped the floor with it, thanks to the fact that it does have DDR5, thanks to the fact that the Ryzen 9 6900HX has more oomph, and that Radeon 680M is a much more powerful graphics card than the Xe graphics that's baked into the NUC. So just looking at the exact same games that we tested the NUC with, CSGO at 1080p high settings, we managed to get 73% faster FPS on the AS6, thanks to, again, to that more compelling CPU and RAM option, as well as that faster GPU. And then in a AAA title like Cyberpunk 2077, testing it at 1080p low, the NUC 13 couldn't even hit a steady 30 FPS average, whereas at 1080p low, the AS6 put up better numbers than the NUC did at 720p low, making it 60% faster at 1080p. When we drop the resolution down to 720p, apples to apples comparison, the AS6 is yet again 72% faster. And then in Reece's favorite game that he loves to stream as of late, Genshin Impact, at 1080p medium, the AS6 was 18% faster. But that is an online game that might not necessarily be ready to take advantage of all the graphical horsepower that we saw this thing put out in games like Cyberpunk. But then in our professional tests, where we render out an 11-minute 4K video, the NUC 13 did that in 26 minutes and 48 seconds while drawing 65 watts of power. Now the AS6 is slightly less power sippy than that. It comes in at 72 watts of power. So a little over 10% more. But with that, it delivers 31% faster rendering times, coming in at only 18 minutes and 21 seconds to render that exact same 11-minute 4K video. So getting a lot of power out of, yes, an admittedly higher power draw, but making it so that things are getting done quicker, so maybe you don't need to be on the battery backup quite as long because you're done with all of that tasks that you had to go on. So Geekcom wanted me to put these things head to head because they sell both of these devices. The Intel NUC 13, I reckon, was a great deal if you're looking for the tiniest, most power efficient portable form factor that you could get in a desktop setup where you don't want a laptop, you want to be at your desk, but still have some power efficiency. So I made sure to go into this comparing these things just straight on performance, and I looked at the price very last. Because what good is all of that extra performance if you are paying significantly more for it? And it turns out one of the reasons why Intel may have recently announced that they're getting out of the NUC game entirely and handing that over to companies like Asus, who helped to produce the AS6, is that the pricing on the AS6 just makes it an absolute no-brainer with all of the details that I showed you. Significantly faster in gaming performance, definitely faster in my productivity tests, as well as barely consuming more power, having the latest DDR5 generation, keeping all of the same connectivities. The NUC, as I had it spec'd, started at $999. The AS6, as I have it spec'd, with the same 32 gigs of RAM, same 1 terabyte hard drive, is $250 less than the NUC, coming in at a price point of $749 over on Geekcom's website right now. And you can even drop that price down if you want to go with a slightly lesser CPU in the 6800H. You keep the same 680M graphics, and that'll drop your price down to $649 with still 32 gigs of RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD. This NUC can get cheaper at $649, but only as a bare bones kit, meaning it has no RAM and SSD. You just have the i5 1340p processor with no additional extras. This thing, at its cheapest price, $659, comes with RAM, SSD, and the power to back it up. So this was an incredible comparison for me to see just how wildly powerful the AS6, powered by Asus, produced by Geekcom, is in comparison to something like the Intel NUC 13. Seeing that Intel's handing off their NUC business to the likes of Asus, hopefully it will bring more price competitiveness between these two, but getting very similar feature sets, better performance on the AS6, and then coming in at a significantly cheaper price point. I haven't seen a completely lopsided victory like this in basically all of the years that I've been doing tech YouTube. And that begs the question, if this had been a Ryzen 7000 mini PC, how much bigger would those performance deltas have been? Because as we know, the latest GPUs in the Ryzen 7000 chips have been absolutely incredible with the 780M. So I'm excited to see where Geekcom Asus can take the next mini PCs from AMD. I'm also interested to see how Asus performs with the mini PCs from Intel, but suffice it to say, I see no reason to buy this NUC 13 when the AS6 exists, unless you need some very specific Intel architecture that AMD just can't provide you. But with that, this video is sponsored by Geekcom. Make sure to check out the AS6 or the NUC 13 at the link in the video description. Big thanks again to them for sponsoring today's video, and we'll be back with more relevant tech videos in the future, my friends.